Oh, drop. I will now drop in the chat room a link to a blog post, and this is where you can find the references that I'll be sharing with you today. So again, I want to thank Paul for inviting me to join you today, as well as the Ideal Steering Committee. And I've learned a little bit about that initiative. And my understanding is that it's really seeking to transform instruction by integrating digital skills and literacies across the curriculum. So much of my career has focused on this kind of integration between technology and liberal education. And what I want to do today is to explore that topic by engaging you in a thought experiment. And this is something that was first posed to me back in 2014 by Randy Bass of Georgetown University when I was working on a project called GEMS with AAC&U, a project I'll speak to a little bit later today. So in the project, we were asked to think about what liberal education would look like if we added in technology and the digital, but Randy encouraged us to flip that around and instead think about what would liberal education look like? What should it look like if we were inventing it from scratch today and adapting it to the emerging digital ecosystem? And I like this approach because it lets us let go of some baggage, some things we do because we've always done them, and really get down to the essentials. So what I will do today is really begin by asking this question: what kind of skills do our students need to thrive in their personal, professional, and civic lives in our emerging digital ecosystem? And in order to answer that question, I'll have to start by explaining, what do I mean by the emerging digital ecosystem? After that, I will give you my vision for what a curriculum would look like to build those skills, and then wrap up with some recommendations and considerations for what it might take to implement that vision. So as I said, I'm going to start by talking about what I think the emerging digital ecosystem is. And as I'm talking, I encourage you to think about what are the skills required to function in this ecosystem. I'm going to use several illustrations taken from our current context, the pandemic and the election, to illustrate the salient features of the ecosystem. And I'd like you to suggest the skills that are required in the chat room, and then I'll pause at a later point and look at those. So the first illustration I want to share with you is probably something, I assume you have something like this where you live, but this is a dashboard for COVID-19 cases in Austin and Travis County, where I live. And it's really emblematic of the availability of data and the visual representation of that data that's pervading our world. It tells the story of the pandemic's escalation and diminution in Austin. It shares data in the aggregate, but also broken down by geography, by demographic characteristics, and time. A different version of something like that is shown on this next slide. And this is the COVID-19 dashboard for my institution, St. Edward's University. We're gathering data using our ubiquitous digital tools. This dashboard shows rates of quarantine and isolation among the St. Edward's community. And we've been collecting this information in part because we require community members to do a daily screening, especially if they're going to be on campus. So there's a badge I did on Tuesday that shows I was indeed able to be on campus Tuesday if I wanted to. Another change that we've made is all of our buildings are locked down, and you have to use your ID or your mobile credentials on your phone in order to get into buildings. And this allows us to do contact tracing if anybody has been exposed to COVID-19. And these are just a couple of the ways that we're partnering with technology to solve the problems presented by the pandemic. Here's another version of the data that's surrounding us. The election is giving us a similarly large flood of data, from the constant polling numbers to the money spent on advertising to the early voting numbers. In fact, early voting has been so popular in Central Texas, where I live, that we have now already surpassed the total number of votes that were cast in the 2016 presidential election. And another change that happened, the screenshot I'm showing you shows wait times on the first day of early voting, but the lines were so long that they actually had to redo the scale so that red, instead of being over 20 minutes, became over 50 minutes. But what's interesting about this screenshot is I think it nicely shows the way that we can get data personalized for us, and then we can use it to inform our decision making. Now, the algorithm that creates this data is pretty straightforward. You just take the number of people in line, multiply that by the time it normally takes someone to vote, and you can generate a list of wait times. But there are a lot of algorithms out there. They're not as straightforward, and we are still using them to inform our decision making. So we have an unprecedented access to data, which we use to inform our decisions. And it's this ubiquity of data and the need to understand, analyze, and make use of it. That's the first characteristic of our digital ecosystem that I want to highlight today. Now I will shift gears a little bit and talk about a different thing that's been going on in our context. I don't know if you, like me, as we went into quarantine, I'm one of those many people that started baking. I'm not doing that so much anymore. Now I'm having to do more exercise to make up for the baking that I did. But early on, I decided that I would learn how to make French macarons. And this made sense because I couldn't get regular flour, but I could get almond flour. And I couldn't get yeast, but I could get eggs. So that works for making French macarons. And I did my research. I looked around online where I could find plenty of recipes shared, tips and videos, and I tried to make them. And you can see the results on the left. They didn't turn out so well. Still tasted great, just didn't look good. But after many tries and consulting multiple sources, I ended up perfecting my technique and my recipe and came up with this lemon macaron that you see on the right. The amateur online baking community that I was tapping into exemplifies what Henry Jenkins has called participatory culture. It's a participatory culture. There are multiple. Members in such a culture create and share their creations across social networks. Learning happens by doing, but also by informal mentorship from the most experienced to the novices, like me. This broad access to creation and production is the second characteristic I want to highlight for the emerging digital ecosystem. Participatory cultures thrive on online networks like this one. I don't know if any of you are on TikTok. I have a teenager who is on TikTok, but it's a viral Chinese video sharing social networking service. It's been in the news quite a bit lately. One, because the president was trying to ban it, but also back in June, teens on TikTok coordinated a prank on Trump's Tulsa rally by requesting tickets they had no intention of using. And while such memes and other viral content get huge amounts of attention, I think what's important to notice about this is the open sharing of content and ideas across digital social networks. And this is the third characteristic I want to highlight for emerging digital ecosystem. It's shaped by networks that are fundamentally social and enabled by digital tools. Finally, I want to speak to the term emerging that I've used, because I don't mean that it's emerging digital ecosystem and next year it will have emerged. Emerging is something that is a constant characteristic. It is the change. It's always changing. It's always new. It's change that is driven by the twin forces of globalization and technology. So in reaction, we need to always be able to negotiate that constant change. In the business world, and in IT quite a bit, we talk about using change management methodologies. Others will call for resilience, but in terms of liberal education, what we're really talking about is lifelong learning. And that's the skill I would start with when I begin thinking about necessary digital skills. And I think 2020 has really brought this sense of change home. The meme that I'm showing you is, this is what it would look like if you're a history student in 2040 and you're doing the chapter on 2020 and trying to highlight just the important things that happen. So all of these illustrations speak to what Randy Bass and Brett Einon in a report for AAC&U describe as the emerging digital ecosystem. It's a world in which, for which we must prepare our graduates and in which we are doing that preparation. So we have to prepare them for it, but we have to learn to function in this world as well. In this world, we learn and we take action through networks. Creation and publication, digital creation and publication is easy. We have ready access to data. We augment our intelligence with digital tools and algorithms to inform our decision making. So you might ask, how well do our students do in such a world? Well, at St. Edward's, we annually survey our incoming students, and I'm sharing the results from 2019. Haven't had time to look at the 2020 results yet. I'm sure you guys understand. But anyway, we ask our students, what do you do online? How do you use the web? And what they tell us, and these numbers have stayed pretty consistent every year. They're very similar. The majority of the students, 87%, use the web for social media. But then when you start looking at those digital creation activities, the highest number we got was 35% who say they share memes, photos, and graphics. We got 34% doing online gaming, 34% making and remixing or editing videos. We also asked them, do you maintain a digital identity? And even though they're mostly on social media, they don't think that they're maintaining a digital identity, or they're not sure. And it's very low numbers who are conscious of intentionally maintaining a digital identity. What these numbers tell us is that our students are not really digital natives. They're actually digital consumers, and they need our help to use technology critically, to move on to higher order thinking skills like critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, critical inquiry, problem solving, and communication. In other words, they need the same outcomes from college that they've always needed, but they need to learn how to gain them and use them in the context of networked participatory culture, data, and augmented intelligence. So at this point, I've been talking quite a bit, and I'd like to hear from you. And I'm also going to, while you're typing, take this opportunity to look back and see which skills you've put into the chat. So I hope that you have put some in. But while I'm looking over that, I'd like you to think for a minute if there are any assignments or ways that you are already engaging your students in the emerging digital ecosystem. And since I know your initiative has been going for 3 years, I hope that you'll have assignments to share. Especially I'm interested in ways that you engage students in working in networks, digital creation, working with data, partnering with technology to solve problems. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and I'm going to look at the chat room to see what skills you might have brought up. So please, again, everybody just take a minute and think and share any kind of assignments that you have been doing and link them to these characteristics. And I don't know if you can hear it, but there's some nice saxophone music going in the background right now. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna, so that I have time to cover everything I want to, I'm gonna pick back up, but I'm happy to see quite a few skills already being mentioned, even including things like information literacy, also making sourdough donuts. That sounds great. But also being a good digital citizen, working with data, social media, data presentation, communication. And then I'm also seeing some of these assignments you're talking about. So like creating videos, summarizing, communicating, I think definitely important, critical thinking, literature research, peer review, OER. Yeah, these are great. Thank you so much. Digital storytelling. Wonderful. So keep those coming. And again, you're giving those not just to me, but also sharing them with each other. And I'm going to pick back up again. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the project I mentioned in the beginning that Randy Bass was leading is the GEMS project, which stands for General Education Maps and Markers. It was a project conducted by the Association of American Colleges and Universities. I think Franklin Paris is probably a member, like St. Edward's is. They're a group that advocates for liberal education. And they see liberal education as preparing students for their personal, professional, and civic lives. The GEMS project was seeking to come up with design principles for general education, which is that piece of education that all students share no matter their major. So they wanted design principles for general education that was equity minded and digitally informed. And the picture here is actually the report that I was drawing on earlier, speaking about the new digital ecosystem. In working on this project, we drew on the work of a couple of labor economists from a report called Dancing with Robots to better understand the world that was going to be facing our students. And so these economists tracked job-related tasks across 40 years to understand what jobs of the future would be. So instead of focusing on specific jobs, they looked at the kind of work that was being done on them. And you can see on this graph that there were two types of tasks that were increasing, a couple that were going down, and then that yellow line kind of goes down and then starts to trend back up. The yellow line is non-routine manual tasks, and I think of that as like the service industry. But the two at the top there are really what we need to focus on when we think about preparing our students for the future, and those are working with new information and solving unstructured problems. The report is called Dancing with Robots because they also point out that workers need to be able to partner with technology to perform these types of tasks. Now, their data ends at 2009, but there's a 2018 report called New Foundational Skills of the Digital Economy that was put out by the Business Higher Education Forum in partnership with a workforce analytics firm, Burning Glass, that comes to similar conclusions. So Burning Glass has over 1 billion current and historical job postings, and they data mine that for information about what skills are going to be needed in the digital economy. The title of this slide, Are You Ready for the Rise of Hybrid Jobs, is from a Fortune article that covered the report, and it's linked off the slide here as well. The jobs are called hybrid because they really argue that the skills that will be needed by workers are skills that cross 2 or 3 of these areas. So human skills, digital building blocks, and business enablers. And so those who will be most successful are hybrid professionals who can draw on multiple areas. To drill down a little bit on these skills, if you look, the human skills are what I would call liberal arts skills. These are liberal education learning outcomes: communication, critical thinking, collaboration, analysis, and creativity. Under digital building blocks, you see some things you would expect: software development, computer programming, also managing and analyzing data, and cybersecurity. Under business enablers, you see some typical business skills like business process and project management, but also digital design and communicating data. In addition to having skills in more than one area, the report also suggests the need to deepen your skills. So not just have sort of baseline, but be able to, over time, deepen your skills by working on projects that would help you demonstrate you have the skills, but give you more experience. In response to pressures like these, the GEMS project ultimately specified 5 design principles. And I'm going to cover 3 of these today. I encourage you, again, to go to AAC&U's website, and you can see resources on the last 2. In the digital working group that I was part of, we really felt like agency and self-direction were especially important for functioning in the emerging digital ecosystem. And if you think back to that participatory culture I described, if you're out there learning in that kind of environment rather than in the classroom, you need to have agency to take ownership, to decide what it is you need to learn, and then go out and find ways and resources to learn that on your own. So that's why we thought that was important. The third design principle speaks to the need to develop problem-solving skills and calls on colleges and universities to prepare students by giving them experience solving problems, getting them to integrate things that they learned in the curriculum and the co-curriculum and community-based learning, as well as linking to prior learning experiences, to have them practice those skills in all kinds of environments, so local, global, virtual communities and networks. And then to take those skills, pull them together, synthesize them, integrate them, and then apply them to unscripted questions and problems. And what I mean by unscripted, these are the kinds of problems for which there's not an easy answer. There's not a ready disciplinary solution. Often they require the combination of multiple disciplines. And if students do this, then especially if they're able to solve problems in areas that they're passionate about, that they're interested in, this can become signature work that demonstrates their learning, and they can use that to go and get jobs, basically. So you might ask, what does signature work look like if it's happening in the emerging digital ecosystem? Because on its own, signature work could just be undergraduate research. It could be that thesis that you're doing, and that's been a typical assignment at liberal arts colleges all along. But I want to point out an example of what it could look like if it's engaging the emerging digital ecosystem. And I'm going to do that by pointing you to a project on the McDonald territory. So this was created by 2 students at Truman State, which is a public liberal arts college in Missouri. They were taking part in an intercampus course between multiple public liberal arts colleges. It was a digital history course on the topic of secession. And the way that this digital seminar worked, there were 2 students from different colleges meeting online in the seminar, and they were studying the phenomena of secession in the United States, and then they all did local research projects. So these 2 students researched a failed secession that happened in Missouri in 1961. And the reason the secession happened was because McDonald County got bypassed on a popular tourist map, and also they got bypassed by a highway in Missouri, and this hit their economy hard. And so they decided they would secede from the state of Missouri, and they call themselves the McDonald Territory. So these 2 students dug into this story. They tell it on their website. They also include story maps and digital timelines. They digitized resources so that you can go learn about the story of secession there. But they also took this story back to their class, and other students in other parts of the country were similarly studying sort of local instances of secession. So they were able to network that knowledge together and learn from each other and use that to look at the overall topic of secession. The authors were Cody Springate and Jonas Cheng. I saw them present about this project at AAC&U's annual conference in 2018. They explained the challenges they faced in persisting. So those challenges ranged from having to do some coding to deal with interface problems on their WordPress site, to dealing with archivists who were reluctant to share their resources and story with the students. So they really had a range of things they had to deal with. They also spoke about how the project allowed them to apply learning from their digital research seminar, but also from other classes that they had taken, and the importance of networking their knowledge together with other students. These kinds of projects are powerful tools to link students to their communities and to see the application of what they're learning in the classroom in that community. They digitized resources. They used primary historical data to fuel their interpretation as they explored the unscripted problem of the place of a secession in American society and history. Not only did they gain experience working in a networked way, they also now have something that they can use to demonstrate that experience, their skills. This is their signature work for prospective employers. And I think such projects are great examples about what is possible, but I also think it's important to notice that one innovative project like this is not enough to effectively prepare our students. So what I want to talk about now is, how do we help them build proficiency, develop proficiencies that are demonstrated at progressively higher levels? So that's principle one from the GEMS project, but also in the report, Foundational Skills of the Digital Economy, they talk about growing competencies from baseline to core to distinguishing. So I'm going to speak to now how we might scaffold signature work in the emerging digital ecosystem. And I'm going to give you my vision by going through a whole series of assignments and learning activities. It's going to be a whirlwind tour, but again, that blog that I linked has links to all of the assignments, so you can go look at them yourselves. And as I'm doing this, I also encourage you to think about the different assignments and learning activities that you've developed as part of your initiative, and think about how you're linking them together to progressively deepen the digital skills that you're developing. So in my vision, I'd start with critical reading. You could use a tool like Hypothesis, which is a social annotation tool. There are a number of other tools out there. This shows, screenshot shows discussion that happened in a class that I was teaching in January, where students are having a conversation around an assigned reading for the class. What's great about social annotation is that students form a network together to learn about the text. You can have peer modeling, but it also surfaces their reading practices. So as an instructor, I can look at what gets highlighted, what they're focusing their attention on, and I can validate that as, yeah, this was a good point that you're making. This was a key point in this article. Or I can redirect, because maybe they're completely missing the thing that I really wanted them to talk about. So that's critical reading done in the classroom, but you can also take this kind of social annotation outside of the classroom, as Remy Holden did with his class. So he used the same tool, Hypothesis, and with his class, he set a specific time where everyone would get together and annotate the same article that was publicly available online. And then he shared that on Twitter, and his students actually participated with other people from Remy's Twitter network and had a flash mob where they annotated the article together. So they engaged with their community to do their annotation. Another way that you might leverage networks is thinking about the social networks that happen in your classroom. And this is an article from Mary Dunn, who's a management professor at St. Edward's. She has her students actually map their own social networks in the classroom, and they use that to study social capital. But then they also go on to think about mapping their personal networks, and they talk about ways that they can develop their personal networks to help advance their careers. So they create personal development networks. Who are the people I know who can help mentor me and help me develop in different areas? So they really begin in the classroom looking at networks, but then take that kind of network analysis and move it on throughout their career. Another beginning kind of activity is citizen science using the iNaturalist app. St. Edward's has a wilderness preserve called the Wild Basin Wilderness Preserve, and you can go to it with your phone and capture pictures of flora and fauna, and that gets aggregated together into the Wild Basin Biodiversity Project. And here's a snapshot of that project. If you go to iNaturalist to their website and search for Wild Basin, you'll get to this. What this has created is a database of information about flora and fauna at Wild Basin, so you can have students, beginning level students, collecting that data, but then more advanced students can come back and use that data to analyze the unstructured problem of the environment and conservation in Central Texas. This is an example of something that Ed Ayers has called generative scholarship. So it's scholarship that creates a resource that other people can use and build on and create more scholarship. Another example, beginning example, is playing with text analysis. And this is an example from a class I taught on Virgil's Aeneid back in 2013. I had my students do computer-assisted text analysis on translation of Virgil's Aeneid. And when they did it, some of the students didn't know to turn on the stop words. That would have turned off the most frequent words like prepositions and articles. And so when they did the word cloud, which is some of the most basic computer-assisted text analysis, that's what showed up big on the screen. But it was interesting because it actually helped my students get to an insight I had been trying to get them to see all semester, which is You really need to focus on learning the dative and ablative cases because Virgil's going to use them a lot. Once my students saw the prepositions with and to, they're like, oh, I see what you mean by a lot. Once you turn the stop words on, though, it also helped my students get to themes that were key in Virgil, which led them to then think about why are these key themes. So other words that you might see on the left side of this word cloud are the word arms and fate, two other important themes that come up in Virgil's Aeneid. And this is this kind of computer assisted text analysis is the kind of data that I deal with in the humanities. At the intermediate level, we need to begin helping our students build agency. One way to do that is helping them think about their own data and take control of it. And an assignment that does that is one that a professor of environmental science at St. Edward's did when he was leading undergraduate students in a study abroad trip and fall semester. They were in Angers, France. He got a grant to buy Fitbits for all of his students, and he had them track their personal health data, like heart rate and sleep patterns, and then relate those to information about their diets, interacting with nature, and their overall perceived stress and health, and then reflect on that. So he didn't have them share the actual data, but he did have them sort of reflect on the patterns that they were seeing. And this is a way to get them to work with data, to make personal connections to the data and begin to take ownership of their own data. Another way of making connections at the intermediate level comes from this example from the digital diversity class taught by Jason Farman. So this is a class that's focusing on the social and cultural impact of electronic media. And what he had his students do is spend a significant part of the semester participating in an electronic community. And then they kept weekly journals where they made connections between the readings and the theories they were discussing in class and the experiences they were having in these electronic communities. So again, beginning to practice integrative learning. Also at the intermediate level, another way to get students to have agency is by letting them see the ways they can have an impact on the world and take action. This project comes from FemTechNet. That's a collective that links together nodal courses and scholars at universities in the US, the UK, and Canada that are all studying feminism and technology. And one of the projects that this network has done together is Wikistorming. That's where students go into Wikipedia and they add information about feminism and technology. But the trick here is that you can edit Wikipedia, but those edits may not necessarily stick. So it's important to learn how to edit Wikipedia by becoming part of the community so that your edits will stay. So students had to learn to, do labor for the community, go in and do copy editing, be part of the discussions that take place in the background of articles. And that's the way you can have the edits that you do create in Wikipedia stay there, make your knowledge more permanent. What was really going on here is they were doing community engaged learning in a virtual community. You can, however, also use digital tools to engage in your local community. So this is an example from Muhlenberg College where Laura Taub's students use digital storytelling to engage their local community members. They then aggregated their stories in a story mapping project. The digital mapping lets them view stories through a different interpretive lens and build networked knowledge. All of these repeated intentional engagement and experiences like these are the kinds of things that can prepare students to get to the capstone level work that we saw in the McDonald Territory Project. So a question I'd like you to think about now, and again, you can answer in the chat or just answer for yourself, but thinking about which of these examples worked for you. Did any of these resonate for you? Are these things you'd be interested in trying yourself? What I've been describing is a vision for scaffolding signature work to reach the capstone level. And really, I want to make this argument that if everyone does innovative digital projects, but we don't talk to each other about what we're doing, then we run the risk that our students are always getting the beginning level. And we need to think about how our work can build off each other so that we can deepen and grow those competencies. In my vision, students become part of learning networks, first within the course with assignments like social annotation or social network analysis, Then in the greater world, with doing assignments like wikistorming, they create and contribute with crowdsourcing, citizen science, blogs, and story maps. They learn the value of data by contributing it, by interrogating their own data, by aggregating their work with others and using it to inform their judgment. And then they can get to the point where they're analyzing all of this data that's been gathered. Through such assignments and learning activities, we can help our students develop the agency to engage their world and the problem-solving skills to succeed. And I think it's important to note that we need to move from a system where it's the faculty and the institutions that are making these connections for our students to one in which our students can make these connections themselves. So again, think about what works for you, but I'm going to keep going because I see I have about a minute or two left. So I'm going to wrap up quickly and leave time for questions, which I hope you are adding in the chat room. The last thing I really want to say is that I recognize that a lot of these digital assignments sound great, but I also recognize that nobody has the energy to try new things right now. At least that's what's going on at my university. So I want to leave with you with some thoughts about what it would take to implement a vision like this. These are based in part on a project that I co-edit that's being published this year called Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities. In this project, my co-editors and I set out to define digital pedagogy by collecting pedagogical artifacts. That's the stuff of teaching. So that's like syllabi, assignments, rubrics, and even examples of student work. In the project, we had 84 curators who wrote essays and collected artifacts from over 721 creators. They use those to explain why one of 59 keywords is important in digital pedagogy. And some of the keywords are things like code and collaboration, failure in field work, hashtag hybrid, mapping, multimodal video and visualization. And again, I encourage you to go look at the project. You can see what else is there. All of these openly shared pedagogical artifacts are actually the product of a participatory culture that I participate in called the Digital Humanities Network. And here's a picture of what that network looks like. They share these teaching and learning materials openly online. By studying these artifacts, my colleagues and I came up with 6 key concepts in digital pedagogy. And these are sort of themes that we saw surfacing in these assignments again and again and again. So again, student agency, I've mentioned the role of identity, openness, collaboration, play, and practice. What I'll leave you with is this slide and then just one more. As you're thinking about what it would take to implement this kind of scaffolded curriculum, I think these key concepts can also help you. So it's important that you're talking openly about your teaching, that you're sharing openly, sharing your own teaching, but also taking advantage of open educational resources, which I saw someone put in the chat earlier, that you're collaborating together, talking about how you engage with data and you're part of the curriculum and how someone else could build on those data skills. You're approaching things with a sense of play and experimentation. And especially anytime you're implementing digital assignments, recognize it's going to be an iterative process where you try it, you play with some things, and then you reflect on how it went and you keep going. Focusing on practice, applied learning opportunities, focusing on giving our students agency. I also want you to think about your own identity. I know that many of us, when we have terminal degrees, we base our identity on the expertise that we have, but recognize that your expertise isn't necessarily just built on that. It's also built on the idea that you have all mastered lifelong learning, and this is another type of expertise that you can pass on to your students. I will finally show one more slide. In our project, another thing we were able to learn from the community that we were drawing on is a lot of advice on how to implement digital pedagogy. And this slide kind of shows a section from our introduction where we imagined and really channeled all the objections that we had ever heard whenever we did presentations like these, and we draw on advice from the community to answer them. So I am going to wrap up now, but I'm happy to answer questions on anything that I've shared. And especially these last points that I've kind of glossed over somewhat quickly. And I think I will stop sharing and let Paul point me to things I should be addressing in the chat room.
Yeah, we've got some good questions already. There is some serious tension between unstructured problems and personal agency. That is, big open problems are scary. Most students react by withdrawing rather than taking responsibility or assuming agency. The assignments need to start off small and accessible and structured. I don't know the best way to transition, though. You have thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something to negotiate yourself, but I think that was the point I'm trying to make. That McDonald territory project, gosh, I want all my students to do that, but you can't get them there right away. Things are too big. And it's funny, we talk about Generation Z a lot. That's what marketers call the generation that we have now, connected since birth. And one of the things that's always said about them is they want choice, but they also want recipes. So I think one way to approach it is give them some recipes, give them 2 or 3 choices and models. And then you can give them an option of, if you'd like to propose something else, we can go there. But here's 3 ways. You also might think about structuring a lot of the assignment and sort of bounding the choice that you give them. So here's the method. We're all going to use the same method. You can choose the topic that you want to address. But if you can't think of a topic, here's 3 that I know will work. I think that's been some of the ways I've approached it for individual assignments. But I also think it's important to think about where our students are. So when you're dealing with freshmen, you definitely are probably going to need to close down more their choices because they're not ready. But once you get seniors in your major, I think that's where you can have more of that independent research.
Thanks. Another question: to have growing competency, it seems to require repeated application/practice throughout the student's academic career at an institution. This could be done in a major, but seems impossible in Gen Ed, where instructors may have very different approaches. How do you coordinate?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was on a committee at St. Edward's that just revamped our general education, which the new Gen Ed started a couple of years ago. And our old Gen Ed had a series of structured courses that were all the same. In fact, I used to teach the general education capstone. And every student at the university had to take it. When we revamped Gen Ed, we moved capstone to the majors, and it became a culminating experience in the major, much broader thing. So there are outcomes that particular piece of the curriculum needs to fulfill, but the way it's done, it differs across all the different majors that do it. The way we've been approaching it is there is a culminating experience committee. We specified some learning outcomes, and they include things like a personal reflection on what you learned from this applied learning, whatever it was. It really is signature work. But that signature work varies vastly depending on what the major is. So, right, independent research in the sciences or collaborative research. It's a strategic management course in the business school. It could be a creative project under visual studies. So we have a set of core outcomes that people are sharing. There's a committee that coordinates it with representatives from each of the schools. So we have 4 schools at St. Edward's. So they do some coordination, and then they have assessment projects they do. But the other thing I would really say, it's that collaboration piece, it's that conversation piece. So something we did that I really enjoyed when we were working on general education is we had a set of university essential learning outcomes, and we had a series of discussions across campus where we said, okay, we're going to talk about problem solving as a learning outcome. To prepare for this conversation, we're going to do a survey. Please share examples of how you do problem solving in your discipline. Then we shared the results of the survey and we had a discussion. And what we found is one of the big challenges here is we all might call problem solving something different. We might approach it in different ways. And the other challenge is because we use different language or because we're in different disciplines, our students don't necessarily transfer. So math faculty are like, we problem solve all the time. That's all we do. And yet students don't realize we're problem solving. So it's also talking to students and getting them to make those connections. And sometimes those connections are obvious to us and they're not obvious to our students. So, it's learning what are the language that we're using in different disciplines. So talking to each other about those outcomes. And I think I heard you mention a digital literacy rubric. I mean, I think it's rubrics like those, and making sure that we all are aware of the same language. So even though we might call it something in our discipline, we can still link it to someone else and we can talk to each other and say, hey, here's what we're doing in my class. You might do something, you may have seen this in another class, or even asking your students, have you done assignments like this? How do you work with data? What is data when you're talking about the humanities, when you're talking about classical studies? Asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah, thanks. We are working on that digital literacy learning outcome now, so your thoughts are helpful there. We have another question. Do you have any experience using badging in the context of a digitally enabled academic experience?
Um, I guess what do you mean by badging?
I think it's credentialing,
Yeah.
micro credentials, things like that.
So, my take on badging, and I've been involved in lots of conversations about badging, it is only as good as if the credentialing organization that presents them, right? So, for example, we have a digital marketing master's program on fully online at St. Edward's. It includes industry certificates as part of the program. Like, you do this digital marketing degree, you will get industry certificates. And that's been great. And they're recognized in the industry and they're important. But if I just give you a badge and say you have data literacy, I guess it depends on, do I respect you? Now, I think, you might begin to think about alternative transcripts. Are there other ways to indicate those skills? How can you communicate it? We've had, our president, when I first started at St. Edward, was really into this idea that every student would have a portfolio and they would share them with share them with employers and they could get a job with it. And our career services department went out and talked to all the employers we worked with, and they're like, no one's going to read the portfolios until those people have passed the first level. So I would say what we need to think about is, how do we help our students know how to articulate? How do we help them get the experiences they need? So internships and other applied learning experiences. How do they put the things together that will get people, get them past that first screening? And that's where those portfolios come in. So to use a recent example, we just hired at St. Edward's a communications staff member within the Office of Information Technology because our last one left us and got a job somewhere else. It was a great promotion for her. We were actually able to hire a St. Edward's graduate, but we didn't intend to necessarily hire a graduate. She graduated a few years ago. She was a communications major. But what really set her apart is that she looked at our job ad. She understood the kinds of things she thought we would need to communicate about. And she put together a portfolio for us and said, here's the communication challenges I see you having, and here's how I'd approach that. Now, she shared that with us after, she'd gotten past into the first round of interviews. But I think that's where you see that sort of badging and portfolio. So I think you need to think about who is certifying those badges. We just opened up the opportunity for some of our students who work for us in IT to get Google certifications. Those are pretty widely recognized. So you need to think about who's recognizing them, who's certifying the credentials. But you might also think about what are alternative ways to show things. So we also, all of our students can do LinkedIn Learning through our university for free. I don't know how widely respected those courses are or not. They might, at least if you list it, bring a second look, and someone might ask you in an interview, oh, I see you've done the change management course. Tell me about how you've applied change management in your experience. That's the interview question I'd be asking. Yes.
I really liked your one of your final slides was on obstacles, and I know at that point in the presentation, you were trying to get to the question section, but can you talk a little bit more about some of the most common obstacles that you've encountered? Because I think a lot of people think a lot of these tools and approaches sound really cool, but they do get intimidated. And maybe not even so much what the obstacles are, but what strategies you've used to overcome those obstacles.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And again, I will tell you the project Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, which was linked off my blog. We wrote a very, very, very long introduction to that project called Curating Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities. But part of that introduction is that obstacle slide I showed you. Because again, I work as AVP for digital learning now, actually, and I run into these obstacles all the time, but I also hear about them when I'm doing presentations. So some of the really common ones, let's say we're advocating for open educational resources, we're advocating for open learning. What about FERPA? Well, there are ways you can do these assignments and get around FERPA. You can provide students alternative assignments. And one of the things I really like, a great strategy, and it's shared in our collection, is actually a FERPA form where you tell students, are you going to do this open assignment that requires you to openly publish online under your own name? Do you want to use a pseudonym, or do you want an alternative assignment? And it really operationalizes. You have the FERPA discussion, you just explain and discuss why FERPA is important. And you really give students a sense of control, and then you give them a way to exercise that control. So that's one strategy. And again, FERPA has been dealt with for a long time. So there are ways to certainly work around that. Another common one is I don't have time. That's true for everyone right now. I don't know how you guys are doing, but everyone at my campus is barely hanging on. And it's been that way since March. We've been working nonstop since last March as we moved. And again, for us, we moved the bulk of our classes online. One of the strategies to approach the time issue is something we like to call the bloom and fade assignment. And so sometimes it's not just, I don't have time to learn this new thing and do it, but it's, I don't have time in my curriculum, in my course to fit it in. So one way is with a bloom and fade assignment, it's something that you do just like one day in the classroom. Doesn't have to take up a lot of time, doesn't have to be worth a lot of points in your class, but it gives students a chance to engage. So when I did computer assisted text analysis in my class, which was really an intermediate Latin class reading Virgil's Aeneid, it was like a one-off homework assignment. I just told them to go play. I pointed them to some free openly available tools online. I said, here's where you can get translations of Virgil's Aeneid. See what you come up with. And that's why they didn't know to turn stop words on. But it began to give them this idea. And it was a class where it would, as an intermediate level class, it was kind of a gateway class into the major. I was exposing them to lots of different approaches to analyzing Latin literature. This just happened to be one of them. So having that very, just one homework assignment wasn't worth a huge amount of points. It's like 3% of the class or something like that. That's one way to approach the time issue, is just do a very low stakes assignment that engages them in playing. And it's a way for you to do something a friend of mine calls toe in the water. You dip your toe in the water, try it out. And then maybe the next time you teach the class, you do a little bit more. So that's, I would encourage you to think, don't try to do everything at once. Please don't try to do a bunch of different technologies at once. I know a lot of our faculty are doing that right now. And I'm like, no, you don't have to use. I'm going to show you lots of different tools. Just do one thing, please. So that's another one. I talked about scaffolding and working together. Another challenge I've seen is students are resistant, right? We think that they're digital natives, they're going to love technology, but not necessarily. When I had my students play with text analysis, I had like classics majors, right? These are people who chose to study Greek and Latin. They're like, no, I love paper and books. So don't be surprised if they're resistant, and, push them a little bit. I think another challenge we've had is, how do you do the tech support, right? And what I would say is, one, Don't pretend that you know all the technology. Be open. I'm learning this technology at the same time as you. And show students how you troubleshoot and deal with problems. Like, say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to mess up, and then you're going to see how I persist and I don't just give up. Because that's what they do, right? They're like, oh, I couldn't get X to work, so I just didn't do the assignment. And like, don't accept that. Hold them accountable and say, well, let's troubleshoot. I was talking to someone, one of our faculty yesterday, who's actually a director, Gen Ed, and she's like, I still can't get my students to use the Quickly app, which is an app we use for attendance taking. And she's like, I keep telling them to go to IT, and now I'm just going to require that they send me the email that shows me they've actually put a ticket in with IT, because that's what they'll do. They're like, it doesn't work. I'm like, well, did you look it up? So I think that's one of those skills we have to teach, and my son, he knows it. He knows better than to come ask me how to do something, because he knows I'm going to say, did you Google it? So he'll Google it first, and then we can discuss problems that he's had. So I think, pushing them and holding them accountable, but also teaching them how to acquire skills and learn things on their own, how to read critically, how not to accept the first search result that they find, that sort of thing. I think that was kind of a round of a bunch of obstacles, objections, but I'm happy to address any specific ones if you'd like.
No, that's really what I wanted you to cover, covering that slide in more detail. That was very helpful. So we are at 4:59. So I think we got in some good time for questions there. So thank you very much, Rebecca. That was very informative. I think, as always, the goal of these sessions is to get us to think about things that we don't necessarily think of often or haven't in the past. And you've certainly met that challenge. So thank you very much. And I think we are done for today, because it just turned 5 o'clock. And
Right. Well, enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your extra hour.
yes, that's right. The clocks go back.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Andrew, what's up?
I just wanted to talk about the schedule for meetings.